This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I think we're going to start the first session. So, welcome everybody. My name is Catherine Davies. I'm the Director of the Institute of Modern Languages Studies. A lot of the Latin American cultural historians and historians are in the languages departments in this country. And my own research is on cultural history precisely of this period, which is really nice because very seldom do I get to share a conference which is about something I'm particularly interested in. So I'm thankful to Mark for asking me to chair this, and of course our institute is sponsoring the event as well. So Mark's put us down from 10:30 to 2, but we're going to take a couple of breaks in between, and we're going to take the first two papers and then have a 10-minute break at about 11:30, just a quick break, and then just before the discussion we'll have another break. So can you hear me back there? You do know, I think these mics do actually work. If you want to later on when we get the questions, you just press the button. I think those little mics do work. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is Francisco Ortega, who is Associate Professor of History at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, and he's Senior Researcher at the Centro de Estudios Sociales. Took his PhD in Comparative Literature at the University of Chicago in 2001. And he's just published a chapter, The Democracy of Blood, The Colors of Racial Fusion in 19th Century Spanish America, in a book entitled Historical Teleologies in the Modern World, which is published here at London, Bloomsbury 2015. And his new book comes under contract also with Bloomsbury, and that's entitled, really interesting, Social Difference in 19th Century Spanish America and Intellectual History. Promises to be very rich. And the subject of his paper today then is the conceptual history of the colonial question in Spanish America. Very apt for a first paper. So thank you very much, Francisco.
Thank you so much.
You've got half an hour.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I want to start by expressing my gratitude above all to Dean King and to Mark Turner for the invitation, and also to their staff, the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London, for making this meeting possible and welcoming us to the University of London. When I started thinking about the paper that I wanted to present today, I thought about doing either one of two things. I could do one of the two things. I could follow doing something that I've been working on, which was the conceptual history of the word colony within the Spanish American realm, or following a little bit more on the tone that Mark had put out there for the call for papers, on the historiographical implications of whatever conceptual history says about the word colony, and what that has to do with the possibility or not possibility of thinking about in terms of postcolonial theory. The none of it, the core problem there for me was that some of the most innovative work on the political history of the Spanish America that has been carried out now really remains very skeptical about the analytical pertinence of the term colonial, colonia, either to name the relationship, the kind of relationships that were established between the peninsular and the provinces of the monarchy, or the post-colonial theory as such. Can you hear me well? Okay. So there is that, a lot of very innovative work within the realm of political history that remains very skeptical of that. And I wanted to explore that a little bit more and what that meant for kind of the conversation that we're having today. So I decided to do something that, well, I hope it works out, and is kind of rely on the previous work that I've done and others have done on the concept of colonial as it transitioned from being from a Coselic's perspective, that is, from being just a word that might mean certain things, to become a fundamental concept that people use in order to understand the world and position themselves within that world. A tool for making and doing things. And so I will rely on some of that, but I could always mention a little bit more and go deeper into that semantic history. But I will use it to explore, really, kind of the tension between this political history that renounces that any affiliation or relationship to colonial and post-colonial theory, and other kinds of positions that are a little bit more open, or certainly more open to that possibility. And as a historian who is a conceptual historian, and a historian that thinks about conceptual history as a way of thinking and understanding the political universe, I'm not interested in closing that door to engage with colonial and post-colonial theory, but rather to problematize it and open it up for further investigation. So let me start by saying that the idea that Spanish American countries experienced and were burdened by the legacy of the Spanish colonialism was well accepted for most of the 19th century and 20th centuries. The movements for political independence at the beginning of the 19th century were viewed as the result of social and economic conditions and the struggle of oppressed nations against the tyranny of the metropolis. However, over the last 2 decades, we have witnessed a Copernican revolution. That's a word phrased by Antonio Anino, one of the historians that have been most involved in this kind of historiographical revolution. Recent historiography views the collapse of the Hispanic order as the result of the political and legal crisis brought about by the Napoleonic invasion and the illegal abdication in Bayonne in March of 1808. As a consequence, if colonial and post-colonial theories and categories were previously accepted by historians of all stripes, now they've been brought under scrutiny, and many scholars challenge their analytical pertinence. The following pages sketch the historiographical and theoretical grounds and consequences of this paradigm shift. Post-revolutionary 19th century political elites in Spanish America used the term colonial to describe phenomena, customs, attitudes, and values which they view as a result of the Spanish domination. Colombian diplomat and politician Juan Garcia del Rio identifying in 1828 the 3 centuries that lasted the Spanish monarchy in America as the spot characterized by ignorance and abject political submission. And according to him, the colonial regime was unjust and odious, wherein involved devout cause and which left a legacy of egotism, leading to a complete disregard for all things of public interest. Such view was further elaborated by mid-19th century liberal Franco and Anglophone reformers. Argentinian Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, for instance, identified 2 great dangers dangling over the continent. On the one hand, the savage nature, and on the other, colonial legacies. For him, colonial traditions were brutal and ignorant, and colonial policies were stupid and insensitive to the clamors of industry and civilization. By the end of the 19th century, patriotic historiography had consolidated a view of the colonial as opposed to modern and European. And by mid-20th century, the term, together with colonialism, acquired the undeniable virtue of endowing the historical analysis of social relations in Latin America, particularly but not solely during the Spanish domination, with a sharpness that was both full purpose and determination. In 1976, social historian Enrique Tanneter noted that the need to rethink the social formation's colonial character that was specific to the 3 centuries of the Spanish domination. For Tanneter's historical analysis suffered from uncritically adopting analytical models based on English and French imperial expansion and proposed to fashion for each social formation the corresponding theoretical object. More specifically, Davies proposed to develop the concept of colonial exploitation as a key to manufacturing the appropriate concept for understanding for the understanding of American colonial social formations during the epoch of primitive accumulation. Davies' plea occurred on the threshold of a new kind of history which elucidated economic and social forces that defined the conflicted nature of early American societies and their insertion in the world economy since the 16th century. During the following decades, historians revealed the contours of that colonial relationship. They talked about the insertion through the conquest and subjugation of American people and territories in an emerging global economic system, the extraction of primary goods, mainly gold and silver, as the basis of the relationship with Europe, the forced reorganization of indigenous societies and the creation of an American domestic market subordinated to the mining economy, the pervasiveness of the repartimiento, the mita, the slavery, and other forms of coerced labor as established modes participating in the world economy, the existence of trade monopoly and tax structures as forms of economic pressure, the church as a form of social control, and later, during the 18th century, they also talk about the administrative, fiscal, and military reforms seeking to optimize the profitability of the colonies according to new geopolitical conditions. All these issues came up in that decade as important, and they provide us with a good picture of the colonial world. Now, these scholars brought to light a number of tensions that had transformed the American societies by the early 19th century. On the one hand, the coherence of local elites whose particular interests gradually Americanized the imperial economy and pushed at least some productive sectors of the economy in the direction of increased autonomy from Spain, the growing financial pressure and bankrupt empire involved in a delicate international scenario, the penetration of the administrative apparatus by patronage networks that remain more faithful to local interests than to imperial ones, the rapid growth of mestizo populations and the concomitant rise of a popular culture whose symbols, for instance, the Virgin of Guadalupe, were deeply rooted in America, the waves of popular uprising throughout the 18th century, and so on. So many other issues that came up, and many other factors, all of which seem to shed definite light on the final causes for the wars of independence. So the social historiography of that moment seemed to provide a good picture of why that Americas changed, why they were colonial, and why they began to move away from the metropolitan village. That colonial, wanted to break away from that colonial village. Now, by the final decade of the 20th century, a new historiographical revolution, as I mentioned, introduced a corrective to the usual perception of politics as chiefly institutional and instrumental in character. The scholars now sought to explore the conceptual universe of the period in order to understand collective and individual actions and their social significance. They follow Ryan Koselleck's, but not only Koselleck's, but Koselleck formulates it well for us. Koselleck claimed that past social and political conflicts must be interpreted and decoded in terms of their contemporary conceptual boundaries and their self-understanding of the parts of past speakers or writers of their own language use. Careful analysis of the practices, representations, and symbolic content of the pre-revolutionary period underscored the crash anachronism of calling colonies the American provinces of the Spanish monarchy. As Spanish-American territories participated, they argue, the scholars argue, participated in forms of political communities which were vastly different and greatly preceded the emergence of modern colonial relations. They also studied the political crisis that shattered the monarchy between 1808 and 1825 and challenged the centrality of the above-mentioned social processes as objective, casual factors of independence. For Annick Lamperriere, one of many scholars who participate in this kind of new history, the existence of a colonial framework is questionable. She notes that when Europeans first arrived in America, the term colony designated, following ancient Roman conventions, settlements established outside the regional political community. To colonize, writes Lamperriere, meant first of all to settle, a migration and establishment of a community that involved taking possession of territory, but not the domination of other people. A look at the early definitions of the word colony seems to confirm Lamperriere's arguments. And according to the Dictionary de Autoridades, 1729, the term colony means population or tract of land peopled by foreigners brought from the capital city or from elsewhere. A definition that is virtually repeated from Covarrubias and many other before, and points to a semantic stability of the word colony. So there is here not a change, a fluctuation of the meaning, but a stability in the way that what that word means. This view of colonies as extensions of the European matrix facilitated the evolution of an institutional and legal system in which the American provinces were recognized as integral parts of the Crown of Castile. In 1519, Charles first incorporated the newly conquered territories into the Kingdom of Castile, and their separation or alienation was expressly forbidden. And even though Colonia, in the sense of less than perfect political community, because that's really what we're talking about here, colony, not as an imperfect political community. It's a community that is not able to be autonomous. So in that sense of less than perfect political community, it was not used officially by bureaucrats or officials in the Spanish Empire, the Spanish monarchy, even though by mid-18th century, around Madrid's court, the word colony began to pop up, to appear in different texts that refer to the American provinces. But it was not official. That's something, it's an ambivalence that has to be noted there. So even though that lexicon, that word did not appear in the official language, contemporary legal scholars have noted a palpable legal and administrative ambiguity in the design of American institutions. More important, for these scholars, for over 300 years, most sectors of society, ranging from white Creoles to castes and indigenous societies, shared in monarchical, Catholic, corporative, and taxist ideals. As a consequence, Spanish-American societies displayed a strong sense of belonging that was neither imposed by the crown nor the result of the Spanish military strength. For Lampier, the fragmentation of the Iberian Empire after 1810 was a consequence of the political crisis caused by the Napoleonic invasion in 1808. The royal abdication of Bayonne created an unprecedented problem of legitimacy that could only be solved by the reversion of sovereignty to local municipalities throughout the monarchy. The fact that, as François Guerra had already noted in 1992, both sides of the Atlantic reacted identically to the threat by patriotically swearing allegiance to the king indicates that more than national struggles against the colonial empire, the Spanish-American independence happened as the unintended consequence of the political crisis that wrecked the monarchy in 1808. At no time during the initial aftermath of the Napoleonic invasion did Creoles or any other social groups represent themselves as colonized subjects engaging in the struggle for national liberation. The pervasive civil wars, once again, this is Lamperriere and her argument, what traditional historiography calls the wars of national independence were nothing more than a dispute over political power on both sides of the Atlantic in a scenario where a new political logic developed in a sort of hence in Guerra's and Lamperriere's view, colonial conditions did not lead to the break with Spain. For Lamperriere, the central point is that at the moment of independence and well into the 19th century, the word colony and colonia had no ideological content. The analysis of the monarchy as colonial domination is an independence period myth. Creole patriots, writes Lamperriere, disowned their past as colonizers and settlers to take up the condition of being colonized, and promoted a negative assessment of this Hispanic monarchy. Furthermore, this ideological twist fueled the emergence of 19th century liberal Creole nationalism and propelled national historiography into colonialism, with which the colonial question went straight into the field of ideology and politics. The contemporary appeal to colonial and post-colonial theories is more the result of past national ideologies than a scientific descriptor of the pre-independence period and its aftermath. In short, and this I guess is very pertinent for us, we're convening under that call, historians and social scientists who appeal to the concept of colony and to the category of colonial reproduce non-critical, mechanical tendencies and brevified languages. So we could be at the risk of doing that, right? As evidence in this summary, historical analysis of the independence period and its aftermath is presently dominated by two clearly delimited and somewhat hostile camps. At the center of their dispute lays the colonial question. On the one hand, social and economic historians continue to explore the processes that sustained and produced relations of subordination, marginalization, and exploitation since the arrival of Europeans to the Americas. They do not shy away, though that does not mean they uncritically embrace the insights and cogitations carried out by colonial, post-colonial, and subaltern scholars from other regions of the world. On the other hand, The new political history maintains a salutary insistence on the conceptual specificity of local histories by recovering the political universe of the period. Such insistence has significantly advanced our understanding of the region's political transformation and reopened for examination the region's 19th century histories of national construction. And though they acknowledge the asymmetry of power relations in the Americas, they forthrightly disallow the appeal to the colonial framework and theory. Furthermore, despite their significant contributions to the field, recent public debates evince an ability on their parts to engage the other side and present sterile polemics. I believe that it's time we move beyond exclusivist interpretive claims into a supplementary reading of the region's rich and complex history. The stalemate is false, and two kinds of counter-arguments can be offered. I'm only going to be developing one of them, but I put forth as two possibilities to counter that kind of stalemate. Right? On the one hand, one might contend to political historians of that kind of new political history, that the claim to describe the world according to the conceptual limits and languages of the period does not preclude the recourse to non-contemporary theoretical terms. It cannot preclude that, because we need theory anyway, and theory is always elaborate and present. But it does insist on maintaining a constant proving relation between what I call concepts and theory. Thus, one might argue that the colonial and post-colonial framework, if properly submitted to conceptual interrogation, yields valid insights into the region's history. And I regard this point crucial, but as I said, I will not pursue it any further in this position paper, mainly because I think it's something that can come up in a conversation in different ways. Instead, I will focus on the second kind of argument, those which remain within the conceptual bounds of the period, and will identify at least three areas where these apparently irreconcilable positions might find important elements of convergence. Koselleck's view of the interdependence and non-reducibility of social and conceptual history stands as an open invitation to bridge this impact. So for Koselleck, both the social and the conceptual can illuminate each other, but cannot conflate, they cannot be conflated, cannot be reduced one to the other. There is always a supplementary relationship to each other, and one always says more than the other anyway. So that kind of non-reducibility allows us to say a lot more about what each of these fields seem to find conclusive. The first area of convergence appears when we realize the new political history carried out by the historiographical revolution, because in addition to insisting on recuperating the self-understanding of and conceptual means by which contemporaries identify, assess, and address their quandaries, it promoted a new approach to intellectual life. Briefly put, it proposed to address the cultural universe of politics by drifting away from the study of pure ideas, values, or norms, and focusing on the speech acts that endow them with localized social purpose and meaning. In other words, investigating the potency and distinctiveness of a concept, say colony, in a given society, the Spanish monarchy, requires identifying the social agents who adopt the term, their social experiences, their institutional and social ascriptions, the institutional means to mobilize the concept, their horizons of expectations, the conceptual innovations carried out in order to respond to specific challenges, and the interlocutors with whom these agents engage in polemics in order to advance their own interests. It is as much an intellectual history of social processes as a social history of language in action. Such dual perspective considerably qualifies Labriere's argument about the term colony not being a fundamental socio-political concept of the period. If we take concepts, as Koselleck does, to be those inescapable words that become the objects of dispute between socially differentiated agents who invest these words with their own definitions in order to legitimate and advance their interests, then one can ascertain, as new studies reveal, that colony was not a post-independence ideological construct. Rather, by the mid-18th century, as other European powers began to acquire significant overseas possessions and Bourbon reforms sought to accentuate American dependency, colony, the word colonia, crystallized the ambiguous legal and administrative experience that had characterized the early incorporation of the Americas into the Kingdom of Castile, and served to project reformist expectations of restoring Spain's splendor using the riches of the Indians. For much of this period, that is the second half of the 18th century, There was a coexistence of older and novel meanings, drawing at once from classical sources, as in settlements within the empire, and the new geopolitical demands of European expansion, that is, the overseas possessions from metropolitan benefits. So there is an enrichment already, an important, significant enrichment of the word colony during the second half of the 18th century. What's significant as well, that a few years later, Spanish-American patriots, I don't mean independence patriots, I mean just notable patricians who sought to transform within the framework of the monarchy, to transform their provinces. Spanish-American patriots tended to repudiate the noble sense of colony as an overseas possessions when applied to the Indies, which they argue threat the American provinces' ancient constitution. So there is an opposition here by the second half of the 18th century between the notion of an ancient constitution and a colony. And that's going to be a very significant tension that blows up during the period of the crisis of 1808 until 1820s. By the early 19th century, the word had transformed from being an univocal and not very controversial term into a fundamental sociopolitical concept of the period and furnished sufficient space in the Iberian world with the semantic means to respond to the political crisis of the monarchy in markedly different ways. Colony developed a semantic nucleus with two slightly different meanings. On the one hand, the concept signal in the aftermath of the crisis of legitimacy and political representation created by after 1808, the uneven modes of representation available to Americans. The inequality perceived by Spanish Americans during parliamentary debates in Cadiz, for instance, supplied the word with unprecedented power. Newspaperman and politician Antonio Nariño wrote in 1811, "We're no longer colonos, but we cannot pronounce the word freedom without being insurgents." As the words intensify, a second meaning became dominant among young military officers in the Republican armies. A colony designated the lack of self-determination experienced by territory or population when subjugated by another nation. It thus became an early antonym of the then nascent concept of national sovereignty. And this is important because it signals the beginning of our contemporary semantic construct. Further research on diverse social experiences and expectations will shed light on the intellectual resources available to Spanish Americans to meet the challenges of their time, including the daunting task of constructing popular versus representative republics. This brings us up to our second point. Our second point from Bertens. Neither pre-revolutionary nor republican societies were static or homogeneous. Since a fundamental sociopolitical concept emerges out of the public dispute among socially divergent and antagonistic agents, it is essential to characterize those heterogeneous and dynamic sites of contestation in order to capture the reach and breadth of a concept. And here we grasp one of the traditional limits of intellectual and conceptual histories. For these historians usually focus, and I am included in that remark, these historians usually focus on literate and elite groups and their intellectual production. In the absence of sources from literary culture, books, philosophical tracts, salons, academies, letters, etc., these historians seem unable to engage the conceptual universe of subaltern groups. Such insufficient theorization about the nature and character of popular participation in political culture of the period, combined with a normative view of modern politics, has led to a blank characterization of them as static agents trapped in traditional Catholic corporative tradition, unable to adequately participate in modern elective and representative politics. As a consequence, this work remained vulnerable to accusation of being elitist and Eurocentric. Historical records, and I think we can appeal here to the work of various of our colleagues today. I don't want to mention because, but some of the people that are present here have actually contributed in this direction to illuminate the way in which subaltern groups do have an intellectual culture of their own that needs to be explored and the benefits of exploring that. So, in short, as a new research agenda gets going for conceptual, social, and political history, it will be foolish to ignore, in that sense, the sustained meditations by subaltern and postcolonial scholars on the methodological difficulties, but also the potential rewards when researching non-elite motivations, intellectuals, and intellectual elite. Finally, I want to mention a third area of convergence. A conceptual approach matters because it allows comprehending the past from the protagonist's point of view. But it's also important because it aligns the horizon of theorization and thus identifies the resources with which we, as from the present, can also think our present as a genuine historical product. As Conceptual writes, the coming into existence of a concept, say colony, establishes a particular horizon of potential experience and conceivable theory, and in this way sets a limit. Thus, the Spanish America broke away from Spain at a moment, and this is important to realize. So that in other words, the possible theorizations about the word colony that were made possible at that moment happened also at a very crucial moment. A certain kind of colonial world was declining at that moment, and a new kind of empire was emerging. So this concept emerges the political concept precisely at the moment of a declination of a certain, a declining of a certain empire formation and the emergence of a new one. So we're at the threshold. Thus, the investigation into the socio-political and conceptual transformations that began to take place 200 years ago and laid the foundations of our contemporary world, and which include the already mentioned histories of the concept of colony, is also an inquiry into our present, the violences that made possible, the promises that remain unfulfilled, and the political possibilities available to us. The emergence of the colonial in its social and political histories identifies the region's entrance into our global contemporaneity, drawing on its discursive traces and orders which appear haphazard and hesitant, offers a privileged mode of writing a history of the present of what has been made in our present. Furthermore, it is in this archaeology of the present that we find that even though the incorporation of the Spanish America into the monarchy and the subjugation of its native inhabitants follow its uncalled for logic, subsequent colonial enterprises undertook their expansion by learning from such logics. Thus, the history of the concept of colony reveals not only the integration of the region into our global world, but the very grounds on which such globality was constituted. Colonial Spanish America stands at the threshold of our contemporary global world. And if the archaeology reveals the violence with which our present has been made, it also provides us with elements to critically engage the present. For just as every past has multiple possible futures, most of which remain unrealized, it is also true that every present has multiple past futures, which were never realized, but remain constitutive of our present. This wealth of possibilities, of past possibilities, which are now our past futures, are truly the realm of experience on which we can draw and theorize to face our present's infinitude. Spanish America is not simply the colonial, but without it, the region and our present world, our present will not be understood. Thank you.